The Observer.
Rob, I'm just going to read out a few things that are going to make you blush, if that's okay.
Okay.
And then we'll start chatting.
Sure.
So, Robert Macfarlane is the Sunday Times and New York Times best-selling author of books, including this one, which we're going to talk about tonight, Is a River Alive? Underland, Landmarks, and the Old Ways. But Rob, the book of yours that's made the biggest impression on me is The Lost Words, which I spent many happy nights reading to my children. It made no impression whatsoever on my children. They wanted to watch another episode of Ninjago and not go to bed. But it made a huge impression on me. I love the book very much. We're going to get into a discussion. There's so much to talk about in this book. I mean, I loved it. I read it twice. There's sort of poetry, there's politics, there's law, there's hope for the future. But I want to start with just a very simple question, really, if I can, and that is just to sort of talk about place, because it sort of zooms around the world like a spy movie. But it begins in your place. It begins in Cambridge, and it begins with a river in Cambridge. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about that river and what it means to you, and why you chose to start there.
Yeah, I can. Lovely to be in conversation with you, Jeevan. And Jeevan has also been thinking a lot about water, salt water, rising water, surging water. And we're going to come on and mix our waters and our watery interests in the course of the conversation. Thanks, everyone, for coming out in the newsroom this evening. And hello to everyone watching at home. Yeah, so I live in South Cambridge. I live on the Chalk. And chalk stream ecology is one of the rarest ecologies in the world. There's a bid emerging to recognise it with UNESCO World Heritage status. There are about 280 chalk streams, depending on how you measure them in the world, and 80% of those are in England. And I'm lucky to live on the Chalk near where one of those rivers is born, and it's born in a little wood called Ninewells Wood, given for the 9 springs which rise there in 2 wellheads. And that is the birth of a brook called Vickers Brook, which in turn feeds the River Cam, which in turn feeds the River Great-Ouse, which meets the sea at the North Sea.
And the opening of the book is incredibly lyrical. So you talk about this river and what it's meant through time to the people who've lived on its banks and the people who've come past it. So just give us a bit of a flavour of that and sort of where, how the book begins and how this river begins.
Well, the first line of the book is 12,000 years ago, a river is born. A river is born twice. It's born in as it were, Earth history. And then it's born over and over and over again as the spring rises and flows. Our flourishing in this landscape in Northern Europe has been coeval with the flourishing of rivers. The ice retreated at the end of the Pleistocene and the handover to the Holocene. The Holocene of the past 10,000 years or so has been the period of just staggering species flourishing for us. It has also been the time when the rivers began to flow because the ice no longer gripped water. The permafrost became porous, the rain could settle, the snow could settle, could seep in and fill the aquifer, and that gave rise to springs, springs gave rise to rivers. So I've been interested in how, when we start to centre water, flowing fresh water as a historical agent, let's say, and not as a passive participant in human history, if we look at the history of Cambridge, my city, that region, water has been organising humans around itself for about 8,000 years. And that's only as far as we know. We have some Mesolithic archaeology which shows us that humans were drawn to those spring sites then.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, Rob, very kindly, I've just written a book about floods. And one of the things that I got asked, there are 2 things that I got asked while writing this book. And one of them is, am I safe from floods? Which is a very difficult question for me to answer. But the other is, why do we choose to build on floodplains? And of course, the answer to why we choose to build on floodplains is that they're excellent places to live for reasons that you've explained in the book in various different ways. I just want to kind of talk a little bit about some of the places in the book and also some of the people. There are incredible people in the book. And maybe just share with us a few of the characters in the book and kind of what they meant to you. And the 2 of the people who stood out to me, and you don't have to choose the same ones, are this incredible fungus hunting woman, with no offense, I'm going to describe as like a sort of truffle-seeking pig almost. She's amazing, just like the way in which she sort of you describe her sort of somehow almost telepathically finding the mushrooms that she was after, these incredible rare mushrooms, almost like she was speaking to the mushrooms. So she really stood out to me. And then all of the woodsmen that you encountered in Canada, and especially the character called the Bear. But you tell us, Rob. There are many characters in the book. Tell me about a few that stood out to you.
Well, I've always been interested in people, which isn't always the case for people who write about place and landscape and nature. However, we understand that great group now. And I suppose this is something we might come on and talk about. What is this strange thing we call nonfiction?
Yes.
This thing that we define by constraint and negativity. Well, one of the things it is partly fictional. And I don't mean that in terms of its relationship to fact. And I think that nonfiction's fealty to the real is one of its absolutely defining and indispensable characteristics and what sets it apart from fiction. But I have learnt so much from novelists, from screenwriters, from filmmakers, from poets. One of the things I've learned is character. And I think of these people as characters. They are absolutely in the world and real in all their vibrancy. And I just wanted to kind of catch that in some way, in the same way that I wanted to write about rivers as characters, rivers as presences. So Giuliana Furci is the truffle-seeking pig of the Ecuadorian chapter. She is a serious Chilean, Italian, British field mycologist who is an outstanding scientist. She's written the two great field guides to the fungi of Chile. But she has, and she has internalized and intuited a relationship with fungi that is making enormous changes to the ways we recognize more than human presence. So she's arguing for global conservation has been structured by flora and fauna, the two Fs. And she has argued for the addition of the third, funga, as one of the great constitutive presences of this world. But I was with her and I watched her say, I think these fungi are near. We were seeking fungi, I should say, in this cloud forest in a river system in Ecuador, where the rights of nature and the rights of rivers have been recognized as a means of helping fortify the protection of that forest, that cloud forest, that river system. And she had to make second collections of two tiny new species of magic mushrooms, which had been collected there a decade earlier. Yes, in effect, one specimen of each mushroom somewhere in this 4,000 hectare cloud forest. Yes, she found them.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And it seemed almost like mystical, the way that she had a connection with it. The thing that really struck me about that part of the book was that I sort of began it expecting a sort of book about water. And then, obviously, because water is like the essence of life, yes, it very quickly kind of widens out to be a book about lots of other living things and about people and about all these connections, really. And I think I mentioned this to you when I was in the green room. I was reading this in the Barbers, and the Barber said to me, well, what's the answer to the question? Is it alive? And I said, I don't know, because I haven't got to the last page yet. But I sort of think, this is a very difficult question. We're going to talk about this question in more detail in a minute. But I thought that your framing very early on was really interesting, where you said, this is quite a difficult question to answer, is a river alive? But a much easier question to answer is a river dead? And, we both watched Dirty Business, this new Channel 4 series, which, shows us some dead rivers in Britain. And, this is a live political issue here where people are very, very angry about it. But let's just start there with that thought of, it is easier, isn't it, to think about zero, think about nature as zero. And is that almost a revelatory moment, do you think, when everything's been stripped away and you can't stop ignoring nature?
Do you mean the moment?
The moment that
it dies,
exactly.
It flatlines. Well, I will just say that the springs near my house they're literally on a life support system. There is something called an augmentation pump fitted to them, which draws water from further down in the system and forces it as groundwater into the earth near the springs, in order that the springs keep flowing. So, in a very real sense, I live by a river system on life support, as close to flatline as it can be, really. It is. I think. Well, I've noticed, shall we say, within the post-Enlightenment tradition, a rationalist tradition within which I was raised, and broadly, I suspect many people in this room and virtual room tonight were raised. I've often seen an embarrassment at the idea of assenting fully to the notion that a river is alive. No, a river is resource, a river is H2O plus gravity, a river is abiotic, it's matter. And there are, to me, fascinating intellectual histories and traditions that have fed and generated that idea that life, what Jacques Rancière calls the partage du sensible, the kind of border between that which is alive and that which is not alive, has been policed and constructed and fortified. But really, we have firmly placed rivers on the far side of that. And they have been instrumentalized for good reasons and to good ends. They have been rationalized for good reasons and to good ends. But that notion of river as resource, not as life force, so the kind of rationalist rather than the animist perspective, has become so dominant in this country, for example. Privatization, which, as everyone here now knows, has been running as a kind of thought experiment in our relationship with the living world and freshwater in this country for about 37 years now, coming up on 37 years now, is highly globally anomalous. There are only 2 countries in the world that have privatized water systems, England and Chile. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Right to Clean Water recently singled England out as a system in dire need of review and reform. So I think in a way, we've naturalized to the point of invisibility the idea that water is just stuff, is just resource. So the work of unlearning, the work of being able to answer yes, or even a partial yes, to this complex question is hard because we have reached this point of sort of full instrumentalization.
Yeah, and I mean, it struck me when I was researching my own book that we live in one of the most extreme places as far as this is concerned. This is almost, because of the Industrial Revolution happening here so early, this is one of the first places that we began to do this. I want to ask you something, Rob, about, we'll talk more about this in a moment. I want to ask you something about language. So early on, you use a word that threw me. You said the river who? The river who?
River who flows.
The river who flows.
Yeah.
Tell me about that choice of word.
Well, grammar is sort of congealed ideology in many ways. It is sedimented forms of perception and organization of relation. And English grammar has sedimented the notion of the objectification of the living world. We talk about nature as an it. We talk about it as a which and a that. And French is slightly different, la rivière qui coule. But it interested me to see what happened when we just very slightly rotated and adjusted our conventional grammar such that it became more like a grammar of animacy, a grammar that recognized co-subjecthood, really, rather than objectification. I quote Ursula Le Guin somewhere in the book. She says, it will require a great reach outward of mind and imagination to re-recognize rivers and forests and the more than human world as a kind of living presence and a kind of kin. So that was a tiny attempt to do that. And I'm glad it stopped you in your tracks.
Yes. Yeah.
The river who. It feels odd, right? When you taste it in the mouth the first time, it's a strange formulation.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it was jarring, and I sort of struggled with it for a long time, and I still don't know what I think about it. And I think there's a sort of contrast, isn't there? I think you made this contrast with companies, and we're sort of, we're comfortable with saying, what does Diageo intend, or what does Barclays want?
Well, and companies have a suite of rights as well. They are rights-bearing, more than human entities, if you like. But the notion that a river should have rights is affronting to the polity, as it were, to jurisprudence here. Although that is now starting to change, and so when you look, I suppose the book is divided into 4 places. It's England, my chalk stream, who flows through my life and landscapes, and then Ecuador we've touched on, where the rights of nature were installed in the constitution in this radical reimagining of a sort of political ecology in 2008. Yeah, and then in Chennai, which we might come on to, in Tamil Nadu, where the rivers are dying, but bold, brave attempts are being made to reimagine another way of being with those rivers for people. And then finally in Nitassinan, the Innu homeland, or Quebec, as we might more commonly know it, in northeastern Canada, where again a river called the Mutahekau Shipu, or the Magpie River in Quebecois, became the first river in 2021 in Canada to have its rights declared and recognized in a really beautiful document.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed the parts of the book that were set in Tamil Nadu because I speak Tamil, and so part of it was spent trying to work out what the words that were transliterated into English should be.
Amazing.
Which was like a fun game.
Did you know those rivers? I'm
from Sri Lanka and not India, but like some of them are familiar to me, and so I've been to Chennai, so some of those places are familiar. It's amazing. In that part of the book, I think in that part of the book, and certainly in the Canadian part of the book, there's a conversation about kind of intentionality. And there's sort of like, I've got a sort of two-part question or thought about this. And one part of this is, can we say, how much can we say a river intends something? How much can we say what a river wants? You can imagine the river wants to flow to the sea, but could someone equally will argue that a river wants to provide us with hydropower, for example, it wants to be done. And I guess the second part of this, and we'll deal with both of them, but the second part of this is saying, how can we figure out what a river is saying? Which is like more of a complicated question. But maybe first, and they go together, but first intentionality.
Gosh, they're such interesting questions. What does a river want and what is a river saying? Well, how long have we got? I mean, I think one of the things
we can magic mushrooms.
One of the things we run up against very quickly is the anthropocentrism of language and of ways of imagining will and intent. The question about damming is a very good one, because rivers have, as it were, locked themselves up. The complex watershed ecosystem of the beaver before the mass extirpation of that ecosystem engineer in North America, when hunting and trapping, fur trapping came, was a much more dammed and obstructed river system, and a very healthy one. So it's not that blockage always equals lack of health. These questions are starting to gain valency, because one of what's sometimes called nature-centric governance is starting to find forms in corporations, in government structures in this country and beyond. So to take just one example of that, the River Wye, which is, as many people here will know, is one of the most kind of stricken rivers in England, one of our great rivers flowing in and out of England and Wales, a transnational river in that sense.
Now a river of chicken poo.
Now a river of chicken poo, sewage, sludge, agricultural pollution, soil runoff. I mean, just it sort of convenes all of the complexities of this, the wicked problem of river health, river life, and all that flows from that or is deprived thereof. But I think it's called the Board of Nutrient Management, basically, of the River Wye, which is a really nerdy little bit of kind of complex hydrological biochemistry and governance. Recently appointed, or last year appointed, a voice of the River Wye, obviously a human speaker, but that person was representing the river as best they felt able. They were given equal voting rights with other members of the committee. And it's a tiny thing, but it's a really surprising and interesting development. And the ecological jurisprudence is in effect trying to destabilize an anthropocentric environmental regulation and legislation system, which has been in the making since Roman times. Gaius, the Roman legal theorist of property, in effect thingified the living world and optimized ownership for the benefit of the owner and not of the object. And we live within the inheritance of that, and we have indeed exported it as a set of ideas and a set of jurisprudential practices around the world.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that kind of I wondered about here was, there are people who speak for rivers, and they sort of take up the rights that have been granted to rivers. And you raised this question directly in the book, really. To what extent is this really a relationship or a conversation between person and river?
Yeah.
To what extent is it a conversation between
people and people?
Yeah,
exactly. I mean,
these guys.
Yeah, this sort of jockeying for, in effect, what I call a cosplay animism.
Yeah.
And I think there is a real risk of that. But to discount making best possible efforts towards broadening the realm of the subject, as it were, within our dominant legal structures seems to me a really urgent task. It's not one that can be perfected instantly. It's beset by philosophical and political problems. But environmental law, in its anthropocentric form, has demonstrably failed to protect rivers in this country, let us say.
Yeah.
That's partly due to a lack of enforcement.
Yes.
We do have some very powerful environmental and legal and regulatory frameworks which have gone unenforced for various reasons. So enforcement of existing law needs to happen. But it seems to me that we also need radical reimaginings. And I was drawn to these three rivers the world has many rivers, although actually the world's rivers contain 0.0002% of the world's water.
It's in the ice.
It's in the ice. Well, that is salt and fresh. So it's in the ice and it's in the oceans.
Yeah.
Rivers, I sometimes say, rivers are an endangered species.
Yeah.
When we meet a river, we should be as amazed as if we'd met a snow leopard in the centre of London, or a rhino.
Yeah.
They are astonishing.
Or indeed a river in the centre of London.
Or indeed a river in the centre of London, which has buried and suppressed its rivers, the rivers that made it. And we know about the ghost rivers, as they're sometimes called. And that's where I find these efforts to daylight rivers, which I think you must have looked at in your research, to bring rivers back to the surface of cities. I find it very moral work, a very beautiful work. And I've looked a lot at the timescales. I don't know if you did this, in how rivers revive. And rivers, the life of rivers pours back. It pours back so fast. Change for the ill and change for the good happen really rapidly in wet ecosystems, particularly in rivers. And it's very, very often a revival will be prompted by a catastrophe. So, for example, the revival of the River Rhine. And in Basel, by the way, as some of you will know, people commute to work by jumping into the River Rhine, swimming with their suit and shoes in a Winkelfish inflatable bag tethered to their waist, climb out at their office and get dressed into those. The revival of the Rhine followed a huge kind of chemical fire and consequent pollution in the late 80s. The Environmental Protection Agency in the US was founded following the Cuyahoga Rivers fire in Cleveland, Ohio.
Rivers shouldn't burn.
Rivers shouldn't burn, but they do. So often you have a crisis, and then you have a kind of slow upwelling, and we're living through that now.
Yeah.
The crisis has happened and is continuing to happen around us. It's not burning, but it's poisoning.
Yeah.
And yet, I think this amazing that rivers gather hope and action. They to use Robin Wall Kimmerer's phrase, they convert attention to intention to action with great force, I think.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you mentioned the Rhine, because brilliantly and telepathically you've anticipated my next question, which is about the...
What? Okay.
This is very strange. When I was researching my book, I came across a German engineer who you may know of, called Tuller, who engineered the Rhine. He engineered the Rhine in the late 18th and early 19th century.
In terms of hydro and flow?
Yes. So he made it run fast and straight. He basically said, this is a wild creature. A river should only have one bed. So the Rhine wandered all over the place, and it was marshy, and he made a good German out of it. He made it flow from mountain to sea, basically. But it happened. The Rhine was straightened at the exact same moment that the Rhine became romantically celebrated.
Right.
So suddenly tourists were going up and down the Rhine, and people were painting it, and people were writing poems about it. And so this leads me to a question about poetry, which is why I'm quite suspicious about poetry.
Okay.
Because the very moment when we fell in love with the Rhine through poetry and painting was the moment that the Rhine was being killed, basically. The moment the Rhine, we made it beautiful for our own sake. We Britified it.
Yeah.
And I guess this is a kind of broader question about nature writing and the kind of nature writing that you do. Because it struck me that a lot of the times you don't talk about beauty and you don't try and prettify. You talk about being bitten by insects and, there are ugly things that happen to you.
Yeah.
And I wondered how deliberate that was, and whether that's a sort of counter to certain kinds of nature writing that try and pin the butterfly down.
Well, not only pin the butterfly down, but then caress it and pretend it's alive. And that seems to me highly really problematic. And in the same way we talk about cozy crime, I think we can talk about kind of cozy nature writing. We talked about the cozy catastrophe of science fiction in the 1950s. So we live in an age of polycrisis. We live in a kind of late, arguably terminal Anthropocene. We're speaking today when the rivers of Tehran are burning from the oil which has been released into them by war. So what is the role of books? What is the role of writing at a time like that? Well, one, I think, is not to let value and a sense of the good and a sense of the possibilities of imagining otherwise is not to allow those things to be obliterated by war, to be obliterated by conflict. There's a Brecht line, I think, he says it quite scornfully, I think, but it depends how you translate it. He says something like, what is it to speak of trees at a time like this? You know, there's an implication that it's somehow irresponsible. Actually, I think it's the opposite. I think if one is speaking with responsibility, with struggle, with care, with hope, with celebration of the voices who matter, an extension of an ecological democracy, then this seems to me really important work. I woke up in January and I'd sort of had something like a dream, or one of those half-waking dreams, and it was about the books I'd written being dug up in a casket that had been buried, but they were being dug up in 200, 300 years' time, in whatever the world looks like then. And the casket was opened and the books were read, and I had this very strong sense, what would it mean to pass the casket test? What would it mean to be read then? And for them, would they think, well, this wasn't struggling with the complexities of our time. We don't have to come to conclusions. We don't have to, because these questions are hard. Is a river alive? Is a hard question. I don't reach an answer. I'm sorry to break it to your barber, but you know, the butler did it with the candlestick in the billiard room. No. So I don't know. Did you feel that with what you're writing about? This is, you know, we're wrestling with irresolvable complexities.
Yeah.
But they're urgent ones, right?
Yeah. So the question I tried to answer was, like, we talked about this when we said, like, dirt is matter out of place.
Yes.
That line.
Yes.
Florida water out of place, you know, weeds and nature out of place. So what is it, you know, we spent a long time trying to push nature into its place. That's like, the arc of my book is like the history of that, like how our ancestors lived with floods kind of because they had to.
Yes.
But also like celebrated it, understood it, maybe not celebrated it, but, you know, understood that this happened and that it would pass and that life would resume afterwards. And then we pushed it all away and we were like, okay, we didn't know, I never have to live with this again. And now we're like, well, we can't build a seawall that's quite high enough.
Right.
You know, so I never, you know, and the question that I tried to set myself at the beginning was to say, you know, are we going to get to a place where we say, no, we can take the seawall down a bit and, you know, we can adapt and we can live with this. But also, you know, we live in air-conditioned or heated houses with electric lights and, you know, lovely facilities. And we all like these places, you know, we're very cozy, and it's very difficult for us to like live the lives of our ancestors that were uncozy. And that's the thing that I think you kind of bring brilliantly to life. You know, you talk about nature like biting you and like trying to drown you, and, you know, and still loving it. You know, well, not just loving it when it's sort of serene and peaceful,
being enlivened by it, and that's perhaps different to love. I do love it at times, and I fear it at others. The biting, I should say, happens in predominantly, but not only in Canada. And this was a multiple wave black fly attack on this huge river called the Magpie River. And I mean, I've grown up in the Scottish mountains, and I thought I knew biting insects in the form of the midge, but you know, the black fly basically says to the midge, "Hold my beer." I mean, they are brutes. They are absolute brutes. And the anticoagulants they inject mean that you weep blood, and the histamine they inject means that you swell up. My partner Wayne, we were kayaking down this huge river, far bigger. It was in spate. It was basically in flood, and it was far bigger than us. But his face was so swollen from those black fly bites that he couldn't. In the morning, he had to massage his face for about half an hour so that he could just see where to kind of paddle, because everything had. It was a sort of free bug Botox. That's how I settled it with him. And it reminded me, Bill McKibben, the great writer, arguably The End of Nature, I think is seen now as the first climate change nonfiction book from 1990. He was asked what among many others who were asked this question, what species would you save for the Ark, another flood story? Yeah. And everyone else said, well, snow leopard or peacock. And he was like, the black fly. And they were like, what? Why on earth would we want the black fly in a post-diluvian world? It's like, it will keep us humble. That's humble. And I really relish that. So yeah, these are really complex sense. Something we talked about, and I'd like your sense on. Sorry, I'm aware we haven't actually involved people in the.
Yeah, I feel like we might be losing track of time. We should come to the audience at some point. In a good way, we're losing track of time.
Yeah. A question from me to you, which is one I mentioned earlier. So I'm always interested in this strange term, nonfiction. We're both nonfiction writers. It's such a strange phrase. It is the thing that fiction isn't. We've touched on it earlier. In German, it's the Sachbuch, the fact book.
Not the Roman.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's this sense of it as a kind of flattened domain of absolute obedience to something like the real, that it's kind of language doesn't play within nonfiction. It doesn't. Form is not relevant. Voice, tone. But then I think of the works of nonfiction that are in the pantheon for me. Philippe Sands, who was part of this book club, East West Street's extraordinary works, working with tone, voice, form all the way through. What and it's also like, what is nonfiction for? What is it? What do you feel about that?
That's a great question. I think that so what I feel that fiction and poetry are about is kind of properly understanding the human mind and understanding how we relate to each other.
Yeah.
And for me, nonfiction is more to do with questions of society and how society works. And the thing that I always set myself at the beginning of a book is to try and ask a question that other people aren't asking, and then try and take it to its logical conclusion. And across however many thousand words a book is, quite a lot of thousand words, 72, 75,000 words in a nonfiction book. There's nowhere to hide with that question. You have to take it to its extreme.
Yeah.
And that's the pleasure of it for me. I think the thing that inhibits me is that I was trained as a journalist, and that sort of beats the opinion out of you and beats the color out of you. So you're sort of so used to this kind of newspaper style of writing, of delivering the facts. And I have to remember that it's, poetry is allowed in a nonfiction book, and it is in a way that it isn't allowed in journalism.
It is.
Yeah, and you're allowed to have characters and drama, and yeah.
I feel you've suddenly found yourselves at a therapy session for a recovering journalist. Poetry is allowed. No, but I didn't actually answer your question about poetry. It's a very good one. But anyway, I'll hold that because you might want to put some questions in.
Well, Robert, we should go to the room, I think. But perhaps before we do, I'll ask you just one more question about the sort of the subjects of your book. And one of them is the question, I guess, is that climate, is there sort of in the background, but doesn't feature very strongly in the book. It's much more about other things.
Yeah.
Was that a kind of conscious choice? Did you write it in and out of the book? How did you?
Yeah, it's a really good. I mean, it's very present in Chennai, where that chapter is called Ghosts, Monsters, and Angels, and in a way, this is sort of where we live with rivers now. In many ways, they're either spectral because they've been buried, suppressed, dried up, died, or they're monstrous, as we would see them, because they have returned in vast force. Yeah, rivers remember, they reoccupy. Yeah, as you know so well, they reoccupy their former homes, and Chennai, which is ancestrally a hyper water literate landscape of necessity, now lives in this almost bipolar flicker between a drought so severe that water runs out for large parts of the city each year, and then the monstrous returns of the floods in the form of cyclones. So it is very present there, and we know that climate is hugely moderating the behavior of rivers. There's an extraordinary remote sensing study that was published about 6 to 9 months ago, which was able to track the flow rates of every river on Earth across 50 years. I mean, just staggering large data picture. And what we found is unsurprising, especially to you, which is that where rivers are big and running across less gradient, they are lower and they are slower. And where they are higher and steeper, they are flashier and floodier. So we know that extreme weather events are beginning to reshape the behavior of these creatures we call rivers profoundly. So I think it's there, but I felt that it would expand out, it would dilute, as it were, the focus on rivers, the focus on hope, the focus on damage, and the focus on ways of imagining water otherwise.
Yeah. I am very familiar with the hydrological history of South India and Sri Lanka, partly because my wife, who's in the audience, we fell in love on a holiday in Sri Lanka. And one of the highlights of this holiday was when we were up at the top of a rock in northern Sri Lanka, and an old man approached us and wanted to tell us all about the irrigation systems of this rock. And of course, we didn't listen to him because we were in love, and we were like, yeah, please go away, bore someone else.
And now you wish.
Yeah. Maybe he was an angel or like a god or something, wanting to tell me something very important. Let's come to you. I'd love to hear questions. They may be questions, they may be thoughts, they may be really anything. Oscar is over there there's a hand raised. And let's take a few together. The lady in the black sweater here.
Oh, yes.
And there's another hand raised at the back. So let's take 3.
Hi. It was a question about the idea of the river. So I've been trying to organize sort of community investing to try and save the river test. But one of the issues you've got is that the river is not just the river, it's the land around the river is the problem. So how much is focusing on the, if you like, the river made flesh?
Yeah.
A problem because actually it's constrained by lots of other property rights and lots of other things that you need to overcome.
Yep.
That constrain the river. They're the ones that make it straight.
Yeah.
And use it for what they want to do, and they have rights over it.
Yeah.
Just by dint of being on the bank.
Yeah.
Or owning the banks of the river.
Absolutely. Gosh, I mean,
as Rob, let's take a few questions together and then we'll come back.
Fine.
If that's
I'll
okay.
try
And just as the lady in the black square said,
yeah.
In the middle. Let's go. Yep, just there.
Kia ora, Rob. I'm from New Zealand, and I appreciate that you referenced the Whakanui River. The way that we're taught to introduce ourselves from when we're really little is, hi, my name is Eleanor, this is my family, this is my mountain, this is my river. And what I was interested in is obviously it's hugely complex and related to like identity and, as you said, worldview. And you have quite a respectable length book there, but what didn't make it into the book from what you learned from all of the conversations that you had?
Oh wow! What was left out of the book? Okay, we an hour for that, and there's a lady with a hand raised, I think, at the end. Yeah.
You mentioned it slightly earlier, but I'm curious if you have more to say around this concept of ecocide and what we've witnessed over the last 2 years in Gaza and the genocide, and now what we're seeing in Iran and the broader Middle East, and thinking about the connection between how we treat people and how we treat nature and how we build a world which respects both of those more, and what the interconnection between that is.
Right, 3 little questions.
Yeah.
So can I take those 3 to start with?
And start anywhere you like. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you. They're all brilliant questions. I mean, starting with the tangle of property rights. So Right to Roam, the access campaign group that I'm pretty closely involved with, did a bit of work on the River Dart in Devon recently, and they were looking at riparian rights, so riparian riverbank rather than river water itself, and they found that on a 50-mile stretch, so 100 miles of riverbank, there were 100 different landowners. So that helps us see the difficulty of the problem. A river is, and here we connect to Aotearoa New Zealand, a river is not only its main channel. When we think of a river as a main channel, I sometimes say it's like thinking of a tree as only its trunk. A river has an immense capillary system. It is really its watershed, and so when something is everything in the eyes of the law, it is also nothing, as a Brazilian judge once told me with great sternness. So we can see all of these obstacles to change making, and I feel myself hugely inspired by the community organization that is happening around rivers. In this country, it happened around the Rhine earlier. People are motivated by many different causes, but I think they all can be aggregated under the name of something like love, whether it's for salmon, whether it's for river, whether it's for people. When our river systems are diminished, the cost is ecological, the cost is in terms of public health, but it is also cultural, it is also social. It forecloses forms of being together as communities of humans and as communities of more than humans. So I think we just have to tangle with that complexity. We have to organize as best we can. We have to listen to the many voices and the river's voices. And this is happening up and down rivers across this country. So river guardianship, which is separate from rights, but emerges as a form of organization from something like love, is to me, one of the most hopeful things I see in, as it were, civic society at the moment. So thank you for the work you're doing. All of you, there will be a River Guardian group near you. It feels great just to do something small. Attention, intention, action. Coming to your wonderful question. So the connection here is that in the Whanganui, the Te Awa Tapua Whanganui River Claim Settlement Act of 2017, which was such a landmark in the global rights of nature movement, which is a parliamentary act past to recognize the river, the Whanganui, as a spiritual and a physical and metaphysical entity, spiritual entity from the mountains to the sea. So that full watershed recognition written into parliamentary statute at the highest level it is a beautiful reimagining of what a river is and what a life or lives lived continuously in relation with and co-constituted by and with the river might look like in law. It's imperfect, it's full of problems and compromises, but I think it remains a really exciting piece of legislation. What didn't make it into the book is 64,000 other words. We're back to the flood here. I basically I think I created a reservoir, and then from that I very effortfully carved a river, so it was much greater. And I think part of the work of that was an initial section of about 25,000 words, where I tried to write a double intellectual history of the Enlightenment, which is the rationalist instrumentalizing force, and what I call the Enlivenment, which is the alternative tradition, a philosophical intellectual tradition that has often lived within, woven alongside the Enlightenment. It's there in Spinoza, it's there in Lucretius and Heraclitus, it's there in Coleridge, and it's there in Blake, and there are many other versions of it.
Is there a director's cut coming?
Well, I'm thinking about it. I really want to understand that weave between the Enlightenment and the Enlivenment. So I think I may write a short book on that next. And then finally, insofar as I'm doing justice to any of these questions, to ecocide and genocide. Philippe Sands, who was here, I believe, before Christmas, is one of the driving forces of the election, the proposal to recognise ecocide as a comparable crime to genocide. I have mixed feelings about it. We see, as it were, the hopelessness of international crimes, their recognition and particularly their punishment at the moment. And we're seeing the decay, we're seeing the destruction of even a notional rules-based order that emerged out of that post-war dream of human rights and international law. So in some ways, ecocide, it feels like the last moment in which ecocide could step forward and gain bite and power. It is inextricable from genocide. War is a life destroyer. But on the other hand, as we were saying earlier, these times of immense crisis are precisely when we should be not allowing colonization to colonize everything, not allowing occupation to occupy everything, and not allowing war to obliterate everything. And we should be dreaming and pushing for ways of being better, legislating better, relating better. So I will watch the ecocide conversation with great interest. I expect it to be very present over the next 2 to 3 years.
Rob, thank you. I want to ask you a question that comes out of something your colleague at Cambridge, Partha Dasgupta, wrote. And he talked about, and this sort of goes to the point that you made a minute ago about different traditions and different ways of seeing nature. And he talks about indigenous people and says that they often retreat in the face of modernity. They have lower technology. They're scattered. It's hard for them to put up resistance to the forces that have chainsaws and guns and so forth. But they have something valuable and important to teach us, which is a different idea, a particular relationship to nature. And he talks about one idea, which is the idea of the sacred grove.
Yes.
A place that, may be important for spiritual reasons, but is actually also important for reasons of necessity and reasons of economics. Yeah. And it's a place when the harvests fail, when catching fish fails, it's a place where there may often be some more food because it's a place that's left to run wild. We've obviously kind of lost that connection, particularly in Britain. We've lost a lot of that connection with the past and with those traditions. But how much is that of value in your view? How much are those religious ideas of nature or different spiritual traditions, different ways of seeing nature, of use to us?
Wow. This relationship between the sacred and, as it were, the ecological, by which I mean that in this full kind of inclusive sense of the good, I suppose, and a related and entangled world of co-subjects stitched together by many beings. It is just so complicated. I mean, in this country, when the Reformation happened, in fact, Protestant vigilantes fanned out across the land to visit vengeance upon flowing fresh water, upon springs, because they had been venerated under Catholicism. So idolatry, and at the same time as that was happening in the second half of the 16th century, the Spanish, in their conquest of the New World, were busy, who was of course Catholic, were busy flogging what they saw as idolatry out of their new subjects, an indigenous animist worldview in which you could speak with a river, you may be blessed by a river, you might name your child after a river. You were literally punished by 100 lashes in the main street of your village by the Commission for the Extirpation of Idolatry. So the sacred and the ecological have very often been at odds with one another. And I think that finds a really interesting contemporary expression in modern day Hinduism. So the most sacred parts of the Yamuna and the Ganga rivers, goddess rivers,
are also the least alive.
Are the least alive.
Yeah.
And there is no reckoning really under certainly a kind of contemporary BJP version of Hinduism with that drastic disconnect between the ecological well-being of the river and its beings and its sacredness. Yeah, so that it's a really, really complex area. I sort of think we need to remobilize sacredness. We need to remobilize faith and align it, which is what the Pope attempted. I mean, with Laudato Si in the papal encyclical, which I think was one of the great ecological statements of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking aloud here. But one of the things that kind of struck me when I was doing research was the number of places, up until quite recently, where people had stories about rivers and the ways in which those stories were kind of passed on because they were funny stories. There were stories about, there would be a story in part of Pakistan about how a god had quarreled with his lover and become angry with the river in the process and picked up the river and slammed it down again. And that's why the river flows in this strange way, basically. And so the people remember that the river flowed in this strange way because they knew about the story of the god having this quarrel, basically. So there's a bit of useful ecological knowledge encoded in a story.
Absolutely.
And I guess, this goes to you kind of as a storyteller. We've pretty much kind of completely lost contact with those stories in most parts of the world, especially in this kind of heavily industrialized part of the world. I grew up in a place called Greenford, which you may be able to guess is neither green. There's no Ford visible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So like how, across this huge kind of gulf of like technology and industrialization, how do we, this is part of the answer, I think, and this, all of these people in the room and this conversation
telling different stories.
Yeah. But how do we do it in a way that's just kind of memified or encoded or, is there a way of doing this in a way that kind of like, that is sort of passed on without us almost knowing that it's being passed on?
Gosh.
Just one answer that in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I've often seen, as it were, geology as a continuation of mythology. When we superstitionalize mythology as somehow a regressive knowledge form, we miss exactly what you say, that it has been a form of explanation. A story is a form of explanation. It's also a form of prophecy, because narrative arguably emerged when we began as story making creatures to read signs and on the ground in the land and foretell where they were leading to, and then begin to cast story into the future and say, well, this will probably happen then. That relationship between print and what we now call print is a very old one, and story is one of our very first technologies. It remains so, I believe.
Yeah.
Privatization is a very young story. It's a very anomalous story, but it is a story. It was a story in this country told by Margaret Thatcher for a whole bunch of ideological reasons. Handel's water music was harnessed to it during the Great Share flotation. There was an immense green debt write-off. Culture and politics and public discourse all told an incredibly powerful story. Thatcher says, I will turn you from a nation of shopkeepers into a nation of shareholders. And we bought that story. Stories are neither good nor bad. They're well told or poorly told. And so we need to tell better stories about our relationship with rivers and our relationship with water in the world and in this country urgently now. And we are doing so.
And staying on stories for a moment, the next book is about birds, but then there's a book after that about the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes.
Just tell us, for those in the room who aren't aware of Gilgamesh, just give us...
I don't think anyone in the room will not have read Gilgamesh. Am I right? Is that right?
right?
It's a fluent a room of Assyriologists. And well, look, I mean, as a flood expert and a river, forest and story person, we both share So this is the oldest story that we have, narrative story that we have written.
And the first flood story.
And it is the first flood story. So in its earliest Sumerian form, 4,400 years old, carried to us on clay tablets in cuneiform, which is a writing system rather than a language. 12 tablets that tell the story of Gilgamesh, the god king, who is a kind of flawed and brutal ruler. And he is then brought back into balance by the gods through the generation of his friend Enkidu, and they then go forth on this sort of imperial resource extractive mission, which is really the first telling of what we've been talking about all evening, which is the death of the living world imaginatively. And they fell a forest called the cedar forest, which is the same name as the forest Los Cedros, which occupies the first third of this book, which is saved by moral imagination. And they fell it all the way to the brinks of the Euphrates. They kill the guardian spirit of the forest, Humbaba, and they make a raft out of the logs of the cedar forest and sail it back to Uruk, the city, with Humbaba's head as a kind of sort of grotesque merman idol on the front. So it's all there, all warning, and then terrible things happen. Obviously, all the warnings are there in the oldest story we have.
So what is it? What is it about that story for you? Is it humanity as an agent of destruction? Like, what part of it? What's the way into it for you? That's sort of like that.
It's the extreme uncanniness of seeing ourselves across 4,500 years, seeing our present ecological crisis. It's the kind of bullheadedness of having had this story told and retold for thousands of years. The story that says, don't cut down the forest, don't destroy the life, and don't sail out on the river with the head of the living world as your kind of frontispiece, or terrible things will happen. But here we are telling it and retelling it and retelling it in actuality. So in a way, it's a story about the futility of story. It's a story about story's inadequacy to our time, and it's overwhelmed by force. But then there's a deeply human dimension to it, because Gilgamesh learns mortality, he learns fragility, and he returns eventually to Uruk, a humbled human. And so there is great wisdom in it, as well as great warning.
Okay, I'm hugely looking forward to that. Okay, I'd love to come back and just speak to the room one more time, if we can. And just also to say that Rob is going to stick around afterwards. I'm going to stick around afterwards. There are heavily discounted copies of our books, a bargain, on sale somewhere in this room. This will happen afterwards, but let's hear from you one more time. And there's a gentleman.
I suppose I was interested to know, let's say everyone in the world agreed that a river was alive. Like, what would be the great consequence of that, and would there be any downsides?
Okay, great question. And Alan, I can see at your hand raised. Pink shirt. And then one more at the back. We'll stop there.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could think about the question of whether blood is alive. I mean, it seems to me that if you ask if a river is alive, you could equally ask, is blood alive? And if we take blood out of the body, is it alive or not? I'm wondering if Lovelock's concept of Gaia, where you have a much broader concept of what is alive, might be a better way of representing river. Are you falling into a linguistic trap in distinguishing a liver as a separate thing because you have a word for it?
Right. And one more.
Then one more online, Juben, as
well.
well.
Oh, there's one more online. Okay. Hi. You spoke very briefly about the role Western religion has had on our society's ideas towards rivers, but I know that some legal recognition of rivers has happened from indigenous communities who have argued that the rivers are a physical manifestation of a divine being. I was just wondering, what lessons can we in more secular communities learn from those projects?
And Lily, is there one more question online?
Yeah, Kathy at home says rivers are a communal asset, but it doesn't always feel like they're ours anymore, but instead under corporate governance. Last year in Cardiff, we had a huge volunteer event to clean up the Taff, and people came from far and wide, including children, guides, and scouts. What other ideas does Rob have for making the care of our rivers something we can all, as individuals and local communities, get involved in?
Okay, Rob, don't feel that you have to respond in an itemized way to every question, but it's up to you. Your thoughts.
Yeah. So there's the kind of
The consequences of winning.
there's the consequence of winning and the very reasonable sort of philosophical whataboutery question. Where do we bound life? Why is the river? I think I find rivers useful to think with. And there are arguments now being made, of course, on behalf of AI, something we haven't mentioned now. So if a river is alive, well, is AI alive? Can AI's moral authorship be recognized? And a lot of the people arguing on behalf of or for rights for AI creation or AI beings are reading across from the rights for nature arguments.
Yeah.
So that is a very interesting and I think perilous moment, and we're going to have to navigate that. So I'm sort of using AI to answer think about blood. So I think we have to be careful. We have to mean what we intend by rivers, but also recognize that there is a kind of degree of facticity of contingency to that. They have become the most common form of novel legal subjectivity, and there are emotional, social, and philosophical reasons and constraints to that. So I suppose I took them as my focus because so many people have taken them as their focus. What would the world become if rivers were recognized as alive? A better world. We do have examples of that within banded communities, some of them indigenous. We obviously don't have a planetary scale up for that. And it's very hard to imagine what that sudden transformation of revolution would look like and would bring about. But I think we're beginning to see glimpses of it locally in this country, and indeed of longer duration in indigenous communities. And I suppose I've sort of answered that in the book and slightly answered that in conversation here. I worry a little about the idea that there's this problematic extractive relationship with traditional ecological knowledge, not a phrase I feel particularly comfortable with either, where it's like, well, what have they got to teach us? Well, we'll go in there, learn from them, take it back, be unreciprocal. And yet other communities help us imagine otherwise. And my own engagement with particularly Rita Mestacosha, the poet and community leader of the small township of Ecuador within the Innu Nation, has been for me very transformational. And then there was a final question which came from the audience at home, and it was a wonderful one, and I think it's a good one. It's a good one to end on. So I think we should twin every primary school with a river in this country. I think every child should grow up learning their watershed. I began with that: Nine Wells, Vickersbrook, the Cam, the Great Ouse, the North Sea. I also think we should daylight rivers where we can and where we can't. I think we should paint in great blue swaths on pavement and asphalt and parking lot the route of the buried rivers that we cross every day but do not know we cross, the rivers who have brought cities and towns into being, who give us the drinking water and take our waste away without us ever remembering that they've become abandoned, they've become poisoned, And we need to remember that we live in continuous and vital relationship with them, and really by the grace of their presence. So let blue rivers surface on the pavements of our cities.
Yeah. I mean, there is a river running through journalism, of course. Fleet Street is named after a river.
Exactly.
Rob, I was thinking, while I was reading this book, I was thinking about a phrase that I never use because it's a terrible cliche, and that is the canary in the coal mine. But then, of course, like, the phrase does have a real meaning. Like, there was a real canary, there were real canaries who went down coal mines, and they did die and they died for an instructive purpose. They were telling us something about how dangerous the world was for us. I want to say thank you for writing this book, because it helped me to see things, and it helps us to see things, I think, that are beyond the things that are obvious. I think there's a kind of problem around certain conversations, because some parts of our lives are incredibly easy to measure. It's very easy to look at your bank account and say, well, there are a certain number of zeros, or not very many zeros, or even just a big zero in it. Yeah. And then it's very hard to measure nature, because it sort of moves around and it's sort of invisible and it's hard to pin down, and where does it begin and end, and we've buried it. And so you've made us kind of see something that we don't see often enough. And so thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Robert Macfarlane for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
The Observer.